You laughed. No, I didn't. You laughed. No, I didn't. Oh, yes, you did. You laughed. I didn't. Who of us haven't laughed when we're told something about ourselves that seems stupendously ridiculous? Or perhaps to cover embarrassment and fear. We tend to laugh when we're told something strange and improbable. Well, to have a baby in her late old age, somewhere after 90, with a husband at least 100, is certainly ridiculous. No wonder she laughed. However, I don't think the story's about an old woman defying the terms of biology and giving birth well beyond the age limit of human probability. Nor do I think the Matthew story is really about Jesus breaking the laws of physics and biology by raising the dead and healing lepers and giving sight to the blind and curing every sort of illness. I do think, however, that at depth, both stories are about the same thing. I think they're both about a dearth of political leadership. It's here, with our own current global crisis in leadership, that the texts speak to us today. They connect with our experience. Sarah laughed at the very thought she could conceive that anything could change for her. She'd lived so long with disappointment and the embarrassment and shame of infertility. So her story is not only about her personal circumstance, her personal biology, but also about her social and emotional circumstance within the political context of her day. So it connects also with our experience of disappointment. I mean, we too laugh when we hear politicians promise justice while the wealth gap widens and more people fall into poverty. We laugh nervously when leaders and nations speak of peace and wars gather momentum. We laugh cynically when politicians and corporations promise environmental responsibility while continuing policies and decisions that heat up oceans, burn forests, expand droughts, and contaminate water. We laugh defensively because it often feels safer than hope and more disappointment. And we laugh nervously because the promises we hear are not reflected in our experience, in our context. We remember Sarah, one of the great ancestors of our faith. She laughed at the absurdity of the promise she would have a child upon whose shoulders the future of the nation would rest. Kings shall come from her, was the promise. She did not have unquestioning confidence in God's promise. Her faith was shaky at best. She was laughing at the absurdity of the stranger's promise. It was well beyond the limit of possibility. She was laughing that the promise and its implied leadership could emerge from such an absurd probability, a vain promise. We laugh with embarrassment because, like Sarah, this all-important ancestor in the story of faith, our own faith is not always confident and secure. 200 years later, Matthew's story about Jesus raising the dead and instantly healing lepers and restoring sight to the blind is also set in absurd improbability. It raises lots of questions. But tucked into the Matthew text, written 50 or 60 years after Jesus' death, is a political statement that clues us in to what's going on. Matthew writes that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. We've heard before how the use of shepherd, especially in the Hebrew scriptures, usually refers to kings and rulers, leaders who have a duty of care. So this story too is about leadership. To say the people were like sheep without a shepherd was a criticism of the current leadership. And we remember that this is a time the people of Judea were living under Roman imperial occupation again, with crushing taxes and widening economic inequality, where the ordinary people were often one harvest or one more tax away from catastrophe, and where religious leaders were often in collaboration with the imperial system. It was into this environment that Jesus sends his disciples. They were sent with very strict instructions. Take no money, and do not stay where you're not welcome. They were told not to display wealth and not to judge. Rather, they were to embody compassion, not to take, but to give life and hope, to proclaim the good news that the kingdom of heaven has come near. Their healing work was to participate in the restoration of human dignity and restore people to the life of community. It seems to me that this is still the work of those of us who proclaim to be followers of Jesus, the one we call the Christ, to work with others where we can to restore human dignity where it is lost or in danger, and restore people into community. Crowds today are still harassed and excluded from participation in communities and in our social structures. There are still people exhausted by the cost of living and economic insecurity. There are still people, young and old, stressed and anxious about climate collapse. People fleeing from wars they did not create or want. People denied health and healing through spiraling costs and a lack of doctors and a lack of somewhere warm to live. There are still communities struggling with the wounds of colonization. And the list can go on. And we are to face all of this. Jesus' instruction to his disciples and to us was not to try to fix all the pain they found, but to do whatever they could, where they could, and to proclaim the hope that there is another way. Change is not beyond the limits of possibility. We know that change in community can begin with small acts of kindness and courage and hospitality. We've seen many examples of this during the COVID crisis, and we see it every time there is a climate-related disaster or a call for food from a helping agency. And when we welcome strangers, hospitality becomes holy. Abraham and Sarah found this with the strangers they welcomed. And the disciples experienced it too when it was offered to them with generous hospitality, generosity and compassion. But while this is instructive for us as individuals, it is reasonable for us to wonder if this is enough when there is a dearth of compassionate political leadership on the global stage to take us into a healthy future. Many years ago, I was at a World Council of Churches conference, and at that conference, I was overwhelmed with an awareness that the Christian church itself was a global transnational player on the world stage. And if only all its different parts could find the will and the way to work together, it could be an effective participant with others in making peace through justice, in restoring hope and dignity. Pope Leo seems to be determined to stir the conscience of the Church and to demonstrate to the world that the Church has not abdicated its call to uplifting human dignity and proclaiming the good news of peace and justice for humanity and for Earth. He is seen to be a compassionate leader. The temptation for us, however, as individuals and church, and I include St. Matthew's here, the temptation for us is to lose heart and confine our work to what we have always done and what we know we do reasonably well. Sometimes we fall into despair, expressed as helplessness and apathy. And this is easier than stepping up to the very edge of our certainty and then beyond that limits of that certainty. In other words, it's easier than bothering to offer the leadership and hospitality that holds hope in the face of seemingly impossible limits. Yet, our call is to participate in the restoration of human dignity. And sometimes this does feel like a task beyond the limits of probability. But then, think of the combined churches' mobilization against apartheid. That seemed impossible. It was achieved. Some of our most important movements for justice making and the restoration of human dignity today are when people catch a vision and are willing to work together to welcome the people's society streets as strangers and outcasts, the people oppressed by colonization, refugees, the poor, the LGBTQI community, the neurodiverse, those displaced by war or climate. So, let us step beyond the limits of our own certainty into a faith that dares to offer unpredictable holy hospitality and leadership that brings life and hope. Leadership that restores health and dignity, even if it pushes us beyond the limits of our certainty. So as this year unfolds further, it will be important for us to keep our eyes open for those who offer this leadership to our nation and those in our churches who offer this leadership to the world.